Welcome to Foreign Countries, Conversations in Archaeology with me, Ash Lenton. The website is foreigncountries.podbean.com. If you're enjoying Foreign Countries and you think it's worth $2 a month just to keep it going, please become a patron of the show. Go to patron.podbean.com/foreign countries. Today I'm looking at perhaps an extreme end of archaeology, at least in terms of time period. We're going to be talking about the archaeology and heritage of aviation and space exploration. Later on I'll be talking to Dr. Alice Gorman about the International Space Station, but first I'm joined by Professor Tracy Ireland of the University of Canberra to talk about a project called Heritage of the Air. It's a project that investigates how aviation has transformed Australian society over the last 100 years. Tracy, I've got the impression that the story of Australian aviation has been an imperial one or even a nationalistic venture. Have I got that right?
Well, the Heritage of the Air Linkage project emerged out of some earlier research, digital heritage research, that I was commissioned to do for Air Services Australia. And that came about really because 2021 is the year that marks the centenary of the civil aviation industry in Australia. And so, as these anniversaries often do, that got a range of people thinking about legacies and the historical and cultural impact of this industry and other aspects about what heritage was valued and what might not be valued. And so after doing that research, we came up with what I think is an interesting response to all of those questions. And what our early research into the heritage of aviation revealed is that it has been very strongly couched in terms of national development and the parameters of a very nationalistic view of history. And in fact, aviation is seen as a tool of national development and a driver for national development in Australia. And really, because I have a background, I suppose, in research that looks at the relationship between archaeology, heritage and nationalism, that was really the hook that got me intrigued, I suppose, in this subject area and led to me, I suppose, seeing, some particular lacuna in the research and holes that I could fill with the methods that I'm interested in experimenting with.
So data collection is a very large part of that, but what is the cognitive approach to this material?
The project has 3 methodological lenses, and they're all quite distinct, but I feel that it's putting those 3 lenses in juxtaposition that I think produces some interesting views. So the first lens is really what we might call visual and material histories, and looking at historical questions through images such as photographic collections and film archives, or material histories derived from museum collections and collections of objects, archives and objects. So those 2 lenses looking at archives and objects, and that lens really includes work that fits into the category of object biography, which is really derived from very much the contemporary archaeology lens. The second methodological lens is framed by digital humanities methods, and that is really looking at digitized collections specifically, and working with resources such as Trove to develop tools that really try and disrupt the archive by using hacking methods to turn up stories that are in the archive but are not well known. So our argument, I suppose, is that the archives contain a lot more stories than these nationalistic histories of this field would reveal. And so using hacking methods to churn through that kind of mass of digitized material to reveal stuff that will surprise us. And that's been perhaps, a really surprising and interesting and fun aspect of the research. And then the third methodological lens is community and people-focused methods, which is based on oral histories and consultation with communities, and for this project, that's been communities of volunteers and communities involved in heritage groups that are curating the legacies of this kind of heritage. So as you can see, it hasn't been a straight data collection exercise. It's been really pinpointing different sources of data in terms of collections, and then seeing which lens should we approach those collections through, and coming up with what smaller collections can we pull out of those big collections to test our methods on, and see what stories we can reveal in each case. So we have a mass of stories emerging that look quite different. Some are based very much on materials and object biographies. Some are being told much more through a visual anthropology methodology, and others are coming from people.
So what kinds of stories are coming out of this research? Did you get any surprises?
The first one I might talk about is one of our object biography research stories, I suppose, and it's based on the biography of the wreck of a plane. We call it the ruin of the Southern Cross Miner. And so that's the name of the plane, the Southern Cross Miner, and it crashed in the Sahara in 1933, I think, as when it was being flown from the England to Cape Town air race by an English pilot with a connection to Australia called Bill Lancaster. And it's quite a long and complicated story, it's actually a bit of a blockbuster of a story. So can be told in many ways. But that wreck sat there in the Sahara Desert, slowly desiccating, along with the body of its pilot, poor old Bill, until the 1960s, when it was discovered untouched by a patrol of the French Foreign Legion. And in the 60s, that story hit the newspapers and piqued the interest of the then librarian and curator at the Queensland Museum called Ted Wickstead. And he organised a mission to go into the Tanza Ruft and retrieve the ruins and the relics, not of the pilot, Bill Lancaster, they left him there, but of the Southern Cross Miner, on the basis that this plane had a special connection to the heritage of Australia. And that connection was that it had originally been owned by Kingsford Smith, Australia's most famous early aviator. But that connection was really quite tenuous.
So where do you start?
And so what our research on this story has been is that starting with the material remains, which are now found in storage in the Queensland Museum, it hasn't been displayed for quite a while. Starting with those material remains, we've looked at them closely to see what we can learn about its 30 or 40 year sojourn in the Sahara all alone. And so we have been writing the object biography of the Southern Cross Miner, looking at those little bits of evidence of the relics and remains. We can see where the parts of the timber structure of the plane were broken away by Bill Lancaster to make fires. He survived for 8 days in the desert before perishing of thirst and cold. And so he left his mark on the body of the plane as he turned it into a form of shelter for himself. Of course, the wind has etched into the timber, and also Lancaster left in the body of the plane a diary where he recorded his experiences in the last 8 days. So it's an enormously effective object, and it has quite an emotional impact for those of us who know its story. So using these techniques of object biography and going through, and what's been, I suppose, a large component of this research is that we have, as archaeologists, we haven't gone to the Sahara to look at the site where the plane crashed, but we have been working in the archives, digging out all of these records about how the rescue of the plane was planned and how they got the money to do it and what they wrote about. How did they get politicians interested in this item? As what they argued was that it was absolutely, because they spent a lot of money doing this rescue, and they were able to raise the money on the understanding that it was an irreplaceable aspect of Australia's aviation history. So really our results show that this relationship to Australian aviation history is really quite tenuous, but that the museum curators and others involved used the effective power of the relics and remains of the physical object of the plane, the skeleton of the plane, to make various political statements and to impact the board of the museum and other stakeholders involved. So using that, kind of theory, I suppose, from contemporary heritage studies and contemporary archaeology that push us to look at materiality in that way, that's been a fantastic case study that we hope to have published soon.
It's a fantastic story. This idea that aviation was an imperial exercise.
The commonly held, or I suppose the dominant understanding of the role of aviation in Australian history and society has been, one, that it was developed as a tool of empire driven by British interests in Australia, that aviation was promoted by imperialists as a technology that would bring the empire closer together. Of course, the technology itself was developed more quickly because of both the First World War and the Second World War, which had the impact of both putting the development of aviation technology into that hothouse atmosphere where aviation was not only, central to the defence of the empire, but also seen as providing leverage for the economic future of the empire after the war. And of course, it meant that large numbers of men and women, to a much lesser degree, were trained as aviators or as technicians who could look after the technology. Of course, as you probably know, the Australian aviation industry, the many small companies that sprang up all over Australia after the First World War were pretty much all ex-First World War aviators who then saw it as a huge entrepreneurial activity. So it was specifically seen and promoted and written about in the newspapers of the time as a tool of empire. In fact, it was also written about in very straightforward ways as being a tool of the White Australia policy. I have a newspaper article from just before the First World War of an airship that was named the White Australia. It was seen as the technology that would enable the peopling of the continent, particularly to the north, where it was seen as unpeopled and threatened by, possible threats from the north. So that context is very stark.
Right, I had not realised that. So how did you gather all the information?
All those links to the White Australia policy, we've really learned about those as a result of our digital humanities hacking techniques using Trove, in that we've created a Trove Twitter bot which tweets out random aviation stories from newspapers, and we found that it was tweeting story after story about the White Australia policy, and so this sent us in that direction of research, which we knew was a link, but the intensity of it really surprised us.
So the sheer volume of that information was really what was so surprising. So this is a large ongoing project. Where is it going and what will you produce from it?
Well, one of the most exciting aspects of the project is that we have 5 PhD students and 1 master's student. And so, a lot of the research of the project is driven by those emerging researchers with whom I really enjoy collaborating. They all have reasonably distinct areas of research, and I'm collaborating with a student called Jess Weston on the biography of the Southern Cross miner. And her project is actually she is personally embedded in the archives at the Queensland Museum. Another student with whom I'm collaborating, Ashley Harrison. Ashley is a First Nations young woman, and her project is focusing on the experience or the encounter between Indigenous Australians and aviation. And her project is called Flight Across Country. And it starts off with an imaginary exercise of asking if Indigenous cultures were included in the Australian national vision of aviation, and if we had a national museum of aviation, what would it have in it to represent the Indigenous experience and encounter with aviation? And so she has come up with the most fantastically imaginative and creative response to that question, and has curated this collection of objects, photographs, artwork, stories. So everything from a basket-like woven model of a biplane from the famous weavers of South Australia, that's in the South Australian Museum, to the very well-known example of the Ballaringi artworks, the liveries, the Indigenous liveries that the Qantas planes now carry or have for the last few years, through to collections of photographs of Aboriginal-led search and rescue missions of early aircraft disasters. So that's just a taste of what's being brought together in her project. So we're very excited to see the outcome of that, and she should be completing towards the middle of next year.
And what are the public aspects of the project?
We also next year will have a travelling exhibition called Time Flies, which is aiming to focus on the social history of aviation, and partly it will be based on crowdsourced images and stories that we're collecting through our website, and it will feature the digital resources, which people can also find on our website already. We have an interesting visualization, for instance, that's using the entire digitized records of all of the incoming passenger cards from airports in Australia can be found in the Australian archives. They're handwritten up until the late 60s and had interesting information on them up until a particular date. People had to write their ethnic identity on these passenger cards and other information like that. But colleagues Mitchell Whitelaw and Ben Ennis-Butler have created code and a platform that reads through these cards and creates images of the plane. It links to linked open data, and so it links the passenger card to other collections that show pictures of the aeroplane that the passenger was on, because they all have a numerical reference tag that can be linked into, and then it puts it onto a map-like visualization showing the journeys. And that's something that's still building and evolving, and that will be one of our featured exhibits in the Time Flies exhibition.
And some major publications are on the way?
We have an edited collection of the journal Historic Environment coming out in November. That will have some introductory papers to the project. And then we're jointly, as a team, working on 2 co-authored books, or multi-authored books, I should say. One is probably just called Heritage of the Air, which focuses on our methods and how we've applied them to the various data sets that I've been talking about today. The other book is a little bit different, and at the moment it's called Plane Stories, and it focuses on both object biographies and also personal narratives, particularly a number of First Nations narratives of experiences and encounters with aviation. And some of those featured at the conference that we had in November 2019, which was a great sort of bringing together and concentration of a lot of the research, and that is driving those 2 book projects as major outcomes of the project.
Thank you, Tracy. I'll look forward to following that, and perhaps you'll come back again. I'm joined now by Associate Professor Alice Gorman of Flinders University. As well as being an expert in stone tool analysis and Indigenous use of bottle glass, Alice is also a faculty member of the International Space University's Southern Hemisphere Space Programme. She is well known on the web as Dr. Space Junk, and she has come to talk to me now about the archaeology of the International Space Station. So welcome, Alice. Can you tell me, what does it mean to be a space archaeologist?
So I've been working as a space archaeologist for about 20 years now, which is a slightly scary thought when I think about it. And my initial focus was space debris, all of the stuff that's in Earth orbit, which is about 35,000 pieces of stuff bigger than 10 centimetres. And I also sometimes look at planetary landing sites, and I have an interest in lunar mining and its impacts on cultural heritage as well. But I started to move into the area of looking at space stations as archaeological sites, based on inspiration from my colleague Justin Walsh, who's at Chapman University in California. And one year, I think it might have been 2015, NASA put out a call for astronaut candidates. And they listed all of the degrees and backgrounds that they thought would make suitable candidates. And they also listed some degrees that they explicitly did not want, and this included archaeology. And this absolutely incensed my colleague Justin, and he started thinking about what could we do? What kind of archaeological project could people do that would show NASA that they were absolutely wrong, and they did need archaeologists? And the idea he came up with was that we should look at the International Space Station and its archaeological record and show that there could be insights about how to design future space habitats that could only come from archaeology. So at this point, he approached me and asked would I be interested in working on the International Space Station. So this was a bit of a departure of direction for me, because I hadn't really been so interested in habitats until that point, but it just seemed like a perfect combination of an extraordinary site, the only thing like it currently in Earth orbit, and one that would be developed in the future into newer and different habitats for different reasons. And I felt he was absolutely on the money. We could use archaeological techniques and archaeological theories to provide NASA with some really concrete stuff about how to design places where people live in orbit or on other planets. So that was the start of the International Space Station archaeological project. Getting funded for it was another question, because we kind of fell in all of these gaps. It wasn't quite archaeological enough for some people. It wasn't quite space sciencey or space engineering enough for others. So we had a bit of a battle to get anybody willing to fund us to do this project. And fortunately, a couple of years ago, we were successful in getting Australian Research Council funding. So we could actually kick the project off. And we're now into our second year of working on it.
As a piece of archaeological research, what are the aims of the project?
I guess before we started this, I hadn't really paid much attention to the ISS at all. So there was a steep learning curve looking at its history, what kinds of engineering constraints existed around designing the interiors and the exteriors, and looking at crew experience on board the International Space Station as well. So this was a whole raft of literature and knowledge that we had to get up to speed with pretty quickly. And of course, the International Space Station is studied by an incredible range of different people from different purposes. But what we realised very quickly was, even though there are social scientists and some anthropologists and ethnographers and psychiatrists and psychologists as well, no one had ever really looked at the material culture as such. And particularly, they'd never done the thing that's really at the core of archaeology, looking at how objects operate across social and symbolic realms as well. So we saw that there was definitely a gap there that only archaeological techniques could really address, which was great for us. But the problem, of course, is that we can't go there. This is a factor for most space archaeology. It's just too expensive to go into space. So we had to think of some creative ways to actually get access to the data. And this again was Justin's idea. He'd been looking at the work of Jason de Leon, who was studying the objects left behind by migrants crossing from Mexico into the US and using photographs to document that. And something interesting about the International Space Station is that it started to be inhabited kind of at the beginning of digital photography. And NASA has taken millions of photographs of the interior and the crew's activities over the 20 years of its habitation. So we had this incredible archival record of what people were actually doing. Now, obviously, this has limitations. Photographs are objects in themselves that have to be looked at critically. They only show certain things, and only certain photographs are actually released to the public. We negotiated with NASA to get photos from their archive that are not publicly released. But this gave us a method to look at change over time in how people used objects and spaces inside the ISS. literally millions of photographs. So how do we do that? So that was the next challenge, really. First of all, we explored the idea that we could maybe do like a community or citizen science project, something that's been done really successfully for identifying different celestial objects in research on wildlife and ecology. But it turned out the restrictions on accessing the photographs would mean that wouldn't be possible. So then we turned to machine learning. So we're working with some machine learning specialists at Chapman University and a wonderful data engineer, Amir Kashefi, with me at Flinders, on automating the process of looking at which objects crew interact with and how they do that and how that changes over time. Some people say, well, is this really archaeology? You're just using images. You're not actually studying the objects themselves. I don't find that a compelling reason for it not to be archaeology, because we're doing the same things all archaeologists do, like looking how objects constitute social behaviour and how human behaviour shapes technology in its turn. So I think that's a pretty valid way of carrying out an archaeological project.
Right, so what kind of archaeological questions are you asking?
Something we found quite astonishing was that NASA had never actually taken this approach before. Engineers tend to have a very sort of black and white view of things. So this object is functional. It has a function and it is to do this. So we were arguing that, sure, a particular object may be intended to do that, but people might use it in different ways, particularly around things like negotiating power, for example. And we were also interested in just who was in what spaces and when. And again, this is something NASA has never particularly looked at. And some very early results showed that, for example, even though there haven't been that many women in space or on the International Space Station, it's only like 11% of all crew members, there seems to be a higher affinity of women being present in a space station module called the cupola, which is a fantastic octagonal shaped window that's generally always pointing towards Earth. So you can just go in there and watch the Earth passing underneath. It's quite amazing, really. So we don't yet know the reason for that, but it's shown us that even a pretty rough and dirty statistical analysis of who is in what spaces could be quite illuminating. And the International Space Station is divided into the Russian orbital segment and the US orbital segment, which includes the European Space Agency and Japanese modules as well. The Russian orbital segment is designed around the earlier Russian space stations, such as the Salyuts and Mir. So it's quite old design, quite old technology. And in general, the Russian crews they do all their experiments in the Russian module. They don't move around the other modules in the way that the non-Russian crew do. So we do have kind of a cultural divide. And in fact, in some ways, we're looking at the International Space Station as a zone of culture contact as well, in the same way that we might look at the conflict and negotiation around European invaders being an Indigenous country and Indigenous spaces. So looking at sort of theories around how material culture is adapted when you have objects coming from two different traditions. So we think there's a lot to be done just by taking these perspectives, looking at how objects might in fact operate across multiple registers and have significance in ways that are quite divergent from pure functionality.
So what are some of the artefacts that you are actually asking questions of?
One object that is my current obsession. If anyone has read my book, Dr. Space Junk versus the Universe, Archaeology in the Future, they'll know that I'm obsessed with cable ties, which are the little straps of plastic that are used for all kinds of purposes. There's a similar object on the International Space Station, plastic Ziploc bags. There's thousands of them up there. They're in almost every picture you see of the interior, yet they're incredibly cheap, incredibly disposable. So how does that object operate in these contexts is one of the questions that we're interested in addressing. How do they get repurposed or recycled? How adaptable are they? How do people use them to overcome the constraints of working in microgravity? And what are the social implications of that? I mean, there's so many questions and so many directions that we could go in. One of the other things we've been looking at, and this really came from an observation Justin had when we started the project, we've been looking at the pictures that people stick on the walls. And this is an interesting one because when we talk to space people about what we're doing, their idea is that because we talk about culture in that archaeological sense, that we're only interested in, how do I describe it, like artistic objects. That's kind of what culture means for them. So unfortunately, by looking at the pictures on the walls, we're kind of playing into that misconception. But all the same, this has proven extremely valuable because no one had looked at what pictures were put up on the walls and how they might change at all, ever, until we decided to crunch some numbers from the data we got from NASA. And it turns out that these images aren't just random things people have stuck up, like you might put pictures on your fridge door, particularly in the Russian segment, have very extensive connections into political events happening back in Russia and to both individual faith-based beliefs of the crew, but also the resurgence of Russian Orthodox religion following the fall of communism. When you do just the normal regular thing that any archaeologist would do, which is to identify them, map their location, map their frequency and how they change, a classic kind of seriation curve, you could say. Look at how they change over time. There are actually patterns there that require explanation. And of course, space archaeology is the archaeology of the contemporary past, but also historical archaeology in that sense. So we're using all the same techniques that historical archaeologists would use, which is all of the archival documentation, oral history accounts, what people remember. So we've got all of those tools at our disposal as well to interrogate these objects and see what they mean.
I'm fascinated by the Russian Orthodox icons, but can you explain the spatial arrangements first and then how the iconography works?
Well, one really interesting problem in space habitats that are in microgravity, which effectively in Earth orbit means free fall, is that there's no direction. There's no up, there's no down. And particularly if you let go of an object or the object isn't attached, it will float around, get sucked into an air vent. We calculated about 3,000 lost objects currently on the International Space Station, which is a bit extraordinary when you think that it's only the size of a 5-bedroom house. But how space habitats have been designed to give people a sense of comfort or a sense of being able to orient themselves easily as they would on the ground in full Earth gravity has been really interesting. Something that the Russians did earlier on, and this was drawn from the work of an amazing interior designer called Galina Balashova, who did the design work for a lot of the earlier Russian space stations, is the use of colour to create an artificial sense of up and down. She used sort of a muted sea green on the walls and a sort of a beige colour on what would be the floor or the ceiling to create an artificial sense of direction. So even though there was no gravity, it would be possible to visually sort of replicate that sense of having up and down. In the US segments of the space station, they haven't gone down that path, generally just white walls. Many of the signs on the walls are in a particular orientation. So if you're going to read them, they kind of invite you to be at a certain angle, the right way up. These were not designed to be visual cues, but have ended up being visual cues as to which way ought to be up and down. But we noticed some other differences as well. So in the US segment, it's not considered appropriate to put religious images on the walls. You'll see lots and lots of mission patches. Anytime there's a mission to space, they design a mission patch, the little circular things produced in iron honourable form so that you can put them on your clothes or as stickers. So there's lots of mission patches, but there are no religious pictures, which is kind of interesting because a lot of US culture is derived from its dissenting religious roots, the pilgrims who came over of conservative Christians in the US. And sometimes this has got in the way of space things. So very famously, when the Pioneer 10 and 11 plaques were being designed. These were two space probes that were the earliest to be sent on trajectories that would take them outside the solar system. Carl Sagan and a group of people decided to send a message on them, and they created a plaque, and on this plaque were outlines of a naked man and woman. There was a huge outcry because the woman's bits were indicated by a little line, and they had to take that little line out. So it's not that religious considerations don't sometimes have an impact on what happens in space, but because it's a largely government-funded facility, these images aren't allowed in the US segment. So this is quite a strong contrast to the Russian segment, where from the very first mission in 2000, there was a small picture of an icon placed on a particular part of the wall of the Zvezda module. This, of course, is in the early years after the breakup of the Soviet state, and perhaps not clear what role the Russian Orthodox Church was going to play in social and political events as they unfolded. But what the icons we see in the International Space Station have shown us is that there's a very deep entanglement of church and state-sponsored space travel. And if you just look at the pictures and notice that there are icons there, you might not think anything of it. It's a well-known Russian tradition that houses have icon corners where the family icons are displayed. So it doesn't seem like such a big deal. And to the US and other European crew, they probably just think, oh, well, they've just decided to put some pictures that are meaningful for them up there. But when we started to look deeper into this, first of all, we noticed that the icons that were displayed changed over time. Some were stuck up and then they vanished and then new ones appeared. So what was causing this? What was the explanation behind this change in the use of these material objects?
Are you talking about object biographies?
What we found was that back on Earth, the patriarch of the Russian Orthodox Church was actually in deep conversation with the leader of Roscosmos, the Russian space agency. They chose particular icons to go into orbit around the Earth and then brought them back to Earth, where they would be celebrated and venerated and taken to particular churches. So the act of placing an icon on the International Space Station became like a pilgrimage for that saint depicted. And there's a tremendous cachet given to space-flown objects that have actually been in space and can be genuinely documented to have been in space. And there's a very strong collector's market for these kinds of objects as well. So just being in space adds significance to an object. And in this case, we had Orthodox saints that were gaining the same kind of cultural capital that a cosmonaut had, and then returning that to Earth. So a kind of a deepening of religious significance by virtue of being closer to the heavens. And some of these icons were sent to commemorate particular significant religious feast days or to lend emphasis to a particular church. While none of this was evident just by looking at the pictures of the interior, what we found out was these simple, often just bits of paper stuck onto the wall as objects, as material objects, had this incredible symbolic and political importance and were representing the ways. We think of crew on the International Space Station as incredibly isolated, and they are. But these objects reflect how deeply entangled this Russian space culture is with beliefs and communities back on Earth. And I think that's really significant.
You have various papers in press now, but where's your research going in the future?
Well, in terms of looking at the International Space Station, we may have a limited future because in 2030, the whole thing may be deorbited and sent to the bottom of the ocean. So we are very keen to do as much work as we can on the ISS in the next 10 years. What we're expecting is that we will find many patterns of behaviour that emerge, as demonstrated by the ICON study, that nobody has noticed before. And we want to turn them into concrete recommendations for ways to design future space habitats, such as the Lunar Gateway that NASA is currently working on. So in terms of the future of this kind of archaeology, we're seeing it as something that has a very practical application and might be incorporated further down the track into habitats that are designed for surface occupation of the Moon and Mars. So in that sense, I'm really excited about what we might accomplish.
My last question is always the difficult one. What does your research mean for the discipline of archaeology as a whole?
Something that always strikes me is that we're so used to working in 1G of Earth gravity that we often don't stop to think about how it is that gravity shapes everything about human material culture and human behavior, human bodies. And at the moment, we've only got this one little example of how human culture operates outside of 1G of Earth gravity. But to me, this means we should be using this one little example, of which there will be more in the future, to turn that lens back on Earth and bring gravity out of the background where it currently is and into the foreground, to actually use it as a new lens to look at human material culture. Now, I don't know how that will go. Obviously, I'm very interested in this, so I've been thinking about it a lot. I mean, one of the ways this might influence how we think about terrestrial material culture is in the relation to objects and memory. So on the International Space Station, because objects get lost so easily, our eyes are not used to focusing on things in the middle ground. And if you let go of an object on the ISS, it floats in the middle ground and people literally can't see it. So they've had to create a whole lot of technologies to replicate gravity. Some of these are Ziploc bags, my favorite. Others of them are Velcro patches, which just occur. Again, any photograph of the interior of the ISS and you will see strips or squares or dots of Velcro. And this is how people keep objects fixed where they can find them. And this effectively is a technology of memory. This is about how memory works in different gravity environments. So for me, this means a way of looking back at how gravity influences memory and hence action in how humans go about their daily life. I think there are ways that we can take insights from looking at human cultures off Earth and use them to explore new ways to look at human cultures on Earth. And again, I don't know yet what this might reveal or what paths it might take us down. But for me, it's another aspect of space archaeology, which isn't about, this little niche thing, these few places that are currently outside the Earth where we see the effects of human behavior. It's about space archaeology as scrying glass, where we can look into the human past as well and reflect on how us being on this planet with these particular conditions affects the entirety of human history. We're just one example of ways in which living beings adapt to different planetary conditions. And I think taking a broader solar system and indeed galactic perspective can only be of benefit to us.
Thank you very much, Alice Gorman. All the publications we talked about today are listed on the website. That's the end of this episode. Join me next time.